When these people are getting discharged, what do you tell them when they're going home? Like, what are the next steps for a parent who now takes their kid home? They're home from the hospital and they're facing life again.
Yeah, so I think it's important to sort of understand why even someone would go to an ER, right? And like why someone would even go to an ER um, for suicidal ideation or any psychiatric thing. And I think the most important thing is just starting from the beginning, like the whole process, right? If as a parent, loved one, or caregiver, you sincerely feel that there's risk. And what I mean by risk is risk to self, risk to others, or risk of just not doing well because you can't take care of yourself anymore because of a mental health issue. So as a parent, if you're looking at your child and you're saying, well, first of all, if they said anything suicidal, that's done. You're going to the hospital or you're calling 911 because we need to evaluate this and address it. But there are other ways and other reasons, I'm sorry, to think about bringing your child in for a crisis evaluation. And that might be, they're just not showering. They're not going to school. They're not taking care of themselves. They're isolated. I can't get them to do anything. They're very flat and blunted. We're going to go over to the ER and get an evaluation because that's emergent. The other things to think about too are like acute psychosis. Sometimes people have a breach of reality. Even a child can have a breach in reality and have disorganized thinking. And if that happens, time to go to the emergency department. And not just suicidal ideation, but don't forget, kids can become violent. They can bang their head. They can throw objects. And I've seen it all. Sometimes they're violent towards you, even as a parent, right? Like becoming very, very physically agitated. And that's something that needs to go to the ER as well. So a lot of reasons why you might want to bring your child to the ER for a crisis evaluation in that behavioral health setting. But once that's done and you go through the emergency department, there are different levels of care too. It doesn't mean that you're going to go to a psychiatric unit. You might go to an outpatient facility that has a higher level of care than like a once a week. So I want everyone to be clear about that. So it depends on the risk. Let's not forget something. Inpatient psychiatric services is for short-term emergency psych care. Plain and simple. It's not a cure. It's to keep someone safe, to get them properly diagnosed, to get them on the appropriate treatment, and then to put together a plan when they go home, right? That's what inpatient psych is for. Now, if you go to the emergency department, and let's just say your child has some passive suicidal ideation, meaning they don't really have an intent or a plan, but they do have some thoughts. And, the crisis intervention team says, I don't think this warrants an acute inpatient hospitalization, but maybe an IOP, which is an intensive outpatient program, or a partial hospital, which means you don't stay at the hospital, but you go to a day program. That might be the level of care that they need. So just because you bring your child to the emergency department, I don't want you to think that they're going to end up in a psych unit overnight. They certainly may if there's an acute safety issue, but there are other options, right? And like I said, a partial hospital, which could be a day program. There could even be what we call IOPs, which are just a few times a week. But there's so many different levels of care. It could be just setting them up with a therapist and a psychiatrist that they see, even less of an interim. But the point is there's different levels of care, and that's going to sort of be determined when you get to that crisis intervention service at the emergency department. But let's think about when you're being discharged from the hospital now. So if you go to the ER, or even if you went to an inpatient psychiatric facility and your child went to an inpatient psychiatric facility, I should say, and they spend a few days there, I want parents to be very, very informed of the care that's going on. So right from the time that they go to the ER, you should be asking a lot of questions and taking a lot of notes. And what I mean by that is, what level of care do you recommend, right? Inpatient, partial hospital, intensive outpatient programs, take notes. If they do go inpatient, who's the doctor going to be? Who's the clinical case manager going to be? What does the daily structure look like? What are the visiting hours, right? Can my child call me? Can they have their cell phone? Can they have their computer? Will there be schooling available? So asking a lot of questions and taking a lot of notes so you're prepared. And then when they're on an inpatient unit, for example, or even an intensive outpatient program, I really want to encourage parents to be very, very involved in that process. For example, there's always a family meeting, and it's very important what history you bring to the table as a parent, because you might know things about your child and your family that your child doesn't know that could be very, very pertinent information for the treatment team, such as your own mental history and family mental history, a potential history of diagnoses like depression in the family, for example, or previous suicide attempts by anyone else in the family. That's all very pertinent information. So you're going to bring a lot to the table as a parent at the family meetings and discussion with the intake coordinator and the doctors. So I just really want you to be very, very involved in the process. So that being said, by the time your child is discharged, whether it's discharged from the ER, or it's discharged from an inpatient unit, or it's discharged from a partial hospital after a few weeks of going every day, you should really have a good idea of the trajectory and the plan for that discharge. And it's usually like a step down model, right? So if it's inpatient, they'll usually step down to what's called a partial hospital, which is just a day program. If it's a partial hospital, maybe they'll step down, instead of going every day, after a week or two, they'll go every other day. If it's a partial or an IOP, maybe they'll step down to seeing a therapist once a week. So it's usually a step down program. And, you should get some really good guidance depending on the circumstances with your child, as to how to handle them day to day and what to look out for at this point, because you should be educated from this whole experience as well, not just your child. This is a family intervention. And a lot of things that we do after a child has a suicide attempt is, not only looking out for these red flags that we talked about, but sometimes really like locking up the medicine cabinet if it was an overdose, and reducing accessibility to means of harming themselves. To having supervision and oversight, and not really leaving them alone at home for a time period until you can regain trust and stability. But that's kind of how the process goes. And I know that can be very confusing and daunting for people, but I think if you go in knowing that, you're just going to be so much more emotionally prepared and just logistically prepared as well to deal with what's happening.